You already know how to solve a variety of problems using multiplication number families. In this lesson, you'll learn about another important application of multiplication and division called ratios. The word ratio is just a label we use when we use multiplication and division to compare numbers. You've already used ratios, you just didn't learn to name them ratios. Let's look at an example of a ratio. Each box has 10 pencils. How many pencils are in 5 boxes? You've worked problems like these using a multiplication number family. Let's work this one. We enter 1 and label it boxes for each box. We labeled the other row pencils. Since we're comparing the number of boxes and pencils, we enter 10 here, since each box has 10 pencils. We have 5 boxes, so we enter 5 here. We want to know how many pencils are in 5 boxes, so we enter an X here. We solve the problem with this number sentence, and see that there are 50 pencils in 10 boxes. You may not know it, but when you solve a problem like this, you're using ratios. This is a ratio. This is also a ratio. A ratio is just two numbers written as division. In other words, a ratio is just the answer you get when you divide one number by another. Let's do the division in this example. In the first ratio, we divide 10 by 1 and get 10. In the second ratio, we divide 50 by 5 and get 10 also. In each case, the value of the ratio is 10. You already know that when we use division to compare numbers, you can describe this situation like this. Each box has 10 pencils. This is one way to describe a ratio. Another way to describe the ratio is to say, the ratio of pencils to boxes is 10 to 1. This sounds more formal, but it means exactly the same thing. We can also write ratios in different ways. The most common is the way we've written it here. We can also write these same ratios like this. This ratio is read as the ratio of pencils to boxes is 10 to 1. This ratio is read as the ratio of pencils to boxes is 50 to 5. Another way to write ratios is like this. These are read as 10 to 1 and 50 to 5. Quite often we use a different way to describe a ratio. In this case, it would be pencils per box. You're probably already familiar with many ratios that are described this way, but you may not have known that they're ratios. For example, a car travels at a certain speed that we describe as miles per hour. It's the ratio of miles driven to hours driven. A scoring average in sports is almost always described with a ratio, such as points per game. Sports is full of ratios that are used to compare the performance of athletes, including yards per carry, runs per game, and many others. When someone is paid by the hour, their wages are described as a ratio. The ratio is dollars per hour, but it's usually referred to as hourly pay or hourly wages. By the way, these are different from salary, which means you get paid the same thing no matter how many hours you work. Here are the ratios we showed earlier. Both of these ratios represent the same value. If you do the division, you get 10 in either case. However, the one on the left is usually the preferred way to write the ratio. It's called the unit ratio because it's the value of the ratio with the bottom number, the divisor, equal to 1 unit. Often, we know a ratio written like this, and are asked, what is the ratio of these numbers? The answer is 10 to 1, which is shown here. In other words, if the question in a problem asks, what is the ratio, the question is really, what is the unit ratio? Here's an example. The family drove 550 miles in 10 hours. What is the ratio of miles to hours driven? To write the ratio, simply write the numbers as division like this. What the question is really asking is, what is the unit ratio? Finding the unit ratio is very easy, since it can be solved with a multiplication number family like this. First, we enter 1 and label it hours, since we want to know how many miles they drive in 1 hour. We label the box hours. We don't know how many miles are driven in 1 hour, so we enter an X here. We know that in 10 hours, they drove 550 miles. When we solve, we find that they drove 55 miles in 1 hour. So the ratio of miles to hours driven is 55 to 1. In the remainder of this lesson, you'll solve problems with ratios using multiplication number families. You'll work the problems on paper and enter your answer in the computer. Now, do the rest on your own.